Well, CA's video is out in the wilds now, and I think it blindsided, well, basically all of us. Kislev and the Demons were both pretty well expected, but I think many of us assumed that the remaining two core army book races would be in, and Cathay would be DLC if they ever even came. Instead, we have Cathay as a core, alongside four individual Chaos armies. Meanwhile, the Ogre Kingdoms and Chaos Dwarves are nowhere to be found. Like, man, what a world. Anyways, I thought for fun we could start this video off with all the stuff I've got wrong. So they aren't doing demons as an undivided faction with monogods coming down the road. Instead, they're electing to start with the combined monogods and no truly demonic faction. I will discuss this later on in depth, however. I also figured that if Cathay was ever going to come, it'd be a DLC quite a ways down the line, like a lot of other folks also assumed. I also predicted that the Ogre Kingdoms and Chaos Dwarves would be in at launch, and I'll discuss that more in depth later as well. Lastly, I also assumed that the standard 8 lords would be in at launch, but instead we're getting 9, which is kind of neat. And then one thing that I'm still unsure about whether or not is truly wrong is the end times. See, on their blog post, CA says that the setting is not the end times, but rather during the reign of Karl Franz. The thing is, we know that there's a demonic invasion coming. It's quite literally what we saw in the trailer. And the first time that happened during his reign was in 2519, which precedes the end times by a scant 3 years. I wonder if they mean they won't be following the end times in the sense that they aren't taking its rules and its combined army crap, and instead, because it strikes me as kind of odd that they would introduce the demons, especially after a campaign where we quite literally tried to eliminate the vortex, which is the single biggest aspect of the end times, and then just shrug and pretend like nothing happened. It would strike me as a very weird thing to do. I am curious to see whether or not the statement does get expanded upon in the next little bit, because at the moment I do find it a little odd unless CA is just kind of making up their own story as time goes along. I guess while we're on the topic of the blog post, we'll get into two more things. One, we now know that there's one more DLC coming for Total Warhammer 2, so it looks like beasts are back on the menu, boys. I mean, sure, they didn't technically confirm that it's the Beastmen specifically, but they did indeed confirm that we have one more DLC coming. This also ties into a later point, so do try to remember that. On a similar note, they also did confirm that the pre-order bonus will indeed be a faction, which is great. I was one of the people getting a little nervous that they'd try and weasel their way out of that one. One other line though that we did get that I kind of seemed like a throwaway line, but to me was kind of important, was the one on mod support. They said they'll discuss it more in the coming months, but it remains in the game. It kind of strikes me as a weird thing to even mention it in the post if nothing's going to change on that front. Like, why would you even bring it up if it's just going to be the exact same as Game 2? Has all of our moaning about the modding restrictions actually changed something? Well, no idea, but I really want to know what this actually is about, and like whether they're changing the mod front for or how they're changing the mod front for Game 3. I suppose there's also technically the option that it'll get more restrictive for Game 3, but I'm an optimist, so I'm going to hold out hope. We also know now that the game is coming to both Epic Games Store and Steam, so for the few people that were concerned that it would be an Epic exclusive, I guess they can finally breathe that sigh of relief. This was always something I never personally believed, but I know some of the folks out there thought that it could happen. As an aside too, as much as I don't like pre-ordering this early out, especially when we have very little game data and literally no data on the pre-order bonus, if you do feel compelled to, CA also has a direct purchase option for both Steam and Epic, and going through them will obviously chuck some more money into CA's pocket rather than helping out Valve. Well, I guess technically I suppose it would go into Sega's pocket, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Alright, so we know we're getting 9 lords at launch. Like a lot of folks, I assume this means 1 for each god and then 2 for Kislev and Cathay each. And if you didn't fail elementary school, you'll probably realize this adds up to 8, not 9. So who is this mysterious 9th lord? I have seen a boatload of ideas, and I'm just going to go ahead and scrub a few of these completely outright. For those of you thinking it'll be Malal or a champion of Malal, abandon hope. It's not going to be that at all. Games Workshop doesn't own the rights to Malal, and they won't be making anything that they can't copyright all to hell and back. This is Games Workshop we're talking about. I've also seen some people suggest Constant Drakenfels, Nagash, and oodles of other Game 1 or 2 lords. Again, won't be the case. We've already been told who the core factions are going to be. They are the 4 Gods of Chaos, Kislev, and Cathay. If for any other faction, we would undoubtedly have a surprise option listed in there for the 9th lord. So what does this leave? Well, either we could get an additional legendary lord for one of the 6 core races, or one that roughly falls within their headers. This last option does bring up 2 interesting options, one being Be'lakor and the other being Yuri. We'll start with the former because I assume a lot more of you know about him than the other. Be'lakor is the only undivided demon prince, the only one to ever get the blessings of all 4 chaos gods simultaneously. He's also in an eternal struggle with Archaon, as he sees himself as being far more deserving of the Ever-Chosen title, and the two of them have tried to kill each other a lot of times. He would be a Demon's Undivided Lord, which in theory actually sort of slots him into the listing of being for all four gods. The statement from CA was, the ruinous powers of Nurgle, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and Khorne prepare for war. While Be'lakor doesn't technically serve any of them, he is actually a part of all of them, which would mean his being there would still leave that statement as true. Their second option, though, would be a pretty super deep dive, Yuri. I don't blame you if that name doesn't seem familiar or mean anything to you. He is a pretty irrelevant character to the modern lore, and he hasn't even been mentioned since Warhammer Fantasy RPG, let alone the battles. Long story short, Yuri was a horse archer during the Storm of Chaos, the end times before the end times were really a thing, who got sent off by Katarin to fight a Chaos invasion up north. He succeeded and managed to snipe out a Chaos champion in the process and stole a fiery jewel from his corpse. Turns out that stealing chaotic artifacts is a pretty dumb move, and he began to suffer from corruption. He became distant and dour, and the hand that picked up the jewel began to mutate into a claw. He eventually left his people so that they wouldn't see what the mutations taking place would look like, and also said he wouldn't kill them when he finally lost his battle with corruption. Okay, whatever, a neat history lesson, who cares? Well, you should, because there's actually two really big wrinkles to this story. Remember Be'lakor? Well, he has a curse on him from Tzeentch that prevents him from ever taking the Crown of Domination himself, the artifact that he needs in order to take on the mantle of the Everchosen, and in the process become the fifth god of chaos. Be'lakor managed to outsmart goddamn Tzeentch, and realized that he could actually take it by possessing mortals. So let's circle back to Yuri then. In the trailer, we actually see him loosely referenced. There's a letter the Tsarina is writing to him. But if you look closer and pause, you'll actually realize some of the words are actually emboldened a little compared to the others. And if you look at those words, you'll actually realize they provide the message, Yuri is the demon prince. The natural leap to come to here is that Yuri is the possessed vessel for Be'lakor that he's using in order to get that crown of domination for himself. This would be one of the ways to make a proper Demons of Chaos faction, because while no individual god has enough units to make up a completely demonic roster, the four of them being squished together do have enough. And Be'lakor has famously done just that on multiple occasions. Now, do I feel confident enough to proclaim this as absolute fact? Hell no. Do I feel confident enough, though, to make this my own personal theory? Absolutely. So let's move over to another faction surprise, though, the lack of Ogre Kingdoms and Chaos Dwarves. I'm personally not crazy about the monogods having pushed out these two races specifically. To me, four monogods will actually play very similar to one another. So in reality, to me, this kind of feels less like 6 different races and more like 3 different races. I think it's an interesting idea and all, but leaving these two behind wasn't a smart move in my eyes. That said, I guess we can all be assured that there'll be DLC for Game 3, or maybe even potentially one of them as a pre-order bonus. If one of them is going to be the pre-order bonus, I would go ahead and just say that it'll be the Chaos Dwarves for sure. Apart from the fact that they actually have presence on the Game 2 Mortal Empires map, which currently actually has a nice empty slot sitting wide open for them. But on top of that too, their roster has a lot of commonality with the Dwarves and Greenskins, with only a small part of their artillery and demons having truly unique requirements for CA to build. Speaking of bizarre faction choices though, Cathay's inclusion does have some interesting connotations. So apart from pushing out actual tabletop factions, it also makes the implication that CA can potentially work with extremely minor factions, including those who never had rules or models. For anyone who's been holding out for an Araby, Albion, Amazons, Ind, or Nippon, or whatever, this can only be seen as good news. I still think my beloved Koresh doesn't have a hope in hell, but I'm still less sure of that now than when I was just a week ago. I guess also while we're discussing Koresh, we should also get into the really meaty implication by all this, the map. We already know for sure that it's going all the way to Cathay's eastern edge at least. But in a PC Gamer interview, we also learned that the map is going to be double the size of the New World, or Game 2's map if you're unfamiliar. I don't think people realize how truly massive that is. A map of that size would require a ton of stuff. So I would say for anyone who thought we weren't going to get the rest of the Warhammer world, you can probably safely abandon that line of thinking. Nippon, the Isles of Alithis, Ind, Koresh, hell, I mean even the Gates of Kalith and maybe even some of the Southern Wastes, I think are all probably pretty safe bets at this point in time. We also did learn that the Realms of Chaos are going to be made into a playable portion of the map, which would sound absolutely incredible to me because it'll let them do some really weird creative stuff there. A long while ago too, I also made my prediction for what the game map would likely look like, and personally speaking, not to toot my own horn, but I think that guess looks pretty much spot on now. If anything, I actually may have undersold the amount of that being available. Looping back to a prior point though, I mentioned they have one more DLC for Game 2 coming up. Now, in theory, this actually throws a bit of a wrench into the time frame that I proposed in yesterday's video, but there's also reason to believe that it potentially won't affect it. So let's start with the reasons why it would be a bad thing. Ordinarily, CA doesn't like to cram DLCs back to back because it'll have them cannibalize each other's sales. So in between Games 1's final content drop and the pre-order bonus, for example, we still had a whopping 5-month gap. And given that I don't think there's any hope in hell of a DLC dropping this month, we haven't had a 3-month gap on DLCs for years and years now, we're likely looking at a March release at the earliest for the DLC. That might make me wonder if they've instead pushed the release date for Total Warhammer 3 to later than what I said yesterday, which was August. I don't think it does, personally speaking. August to March would still be 5 months, which is a totally reasonable gap between releases, and something in the wording of the blog caught my eye. They kept saying, in a few months. Sure, that technically doesn't preclude any maximum duration, like in theory they could keep talking for the next 240 months without being factually incorrect, but it definitely implies fewer rather than greater. This also makes sense too from the reveal standpoint, like why would you do this awesome trailer and build the hell out of the hype if no one's going to see the game for another 9 months? By then all your hype would have died down, it would be pointless. So to me, all signs still point to an August-ish release window. Thankfully, we won't have to wait very long because Grace also did let us know that in CA's new Discord, they're already setting up a few new Ask Me Anything events for the next little while. So I think we'll be getting Intel a lot sooner than we all think we should. That's going to be it for this one, though. As a side note, for those of you waiting on the GPU section to the Performance series, I am going to have to delay that 1 week, as all this new release stuff has obviously screwed up my ability to cover both things. Each of those videos takes about a week worth of editing just to do on its own, so even taking these last few days just to cover the Total Warhammer 3 stuff, it's chewed up the time I needed in order to do that video. I will do my damnedest to get it out for not the coming Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that, though. In any case, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.